Hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, the VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I am pleased to be joined, as I am most Wednesdays, by Dion McCormick, no relation, who is the lead solutions engineer here at Alpha. And today Dion has got some cool stuff to show you regarding classes in Xbasic. Not the kind that you take, but the kind that you define. He'll get into that a little bit later. But remember, today's session is a Q&A session, so by all means, please enter in your questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will take them. So just one more thing before we get started. These sessions are being recorded, and you can find copies of today's recording and others recordings at videos.alphasoftware.com. So let's get started. Hello, Dion. Are you there?
Yes, sir. How are you doing today, Dave?
Hello, Dion. Hang on a second. I'm sure that's...
Let's try it here. Is that any better?
That's it. I probably could hear you. It was probably on my end, to be honest with you. Sometimes
yeah,
I do
a little
that.
Audio today. Well, thank you again. Hey, Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Excellent, excellent. We have a very fun session today. It's going to be a little bit more on the programming geeky side, but some really cool stuff and some really neat techniques that I'm finding that are very powerful and very important from a productivity standpoint. And that's really the key focus for today, is how you can make your coding aspects of your alpha projects more productive and more reusable. It's really, really fun stuff. So go ahead and share my screen. See how it goes there. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, it just came up.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. So as Dave mentioned, we have a Q&A session today, as we do each week. So if you could take the time to go to the Q&A or questions portion of your GoToWebinar control panel, enter in your questions, because we'll be monitoring that through our presentation today and queuing those up, both questions we've already gotten via email and also questions that come up on our presentation today, and anything you're interested in. Let us know. We're here to help you out, and what we want to know is what you need to understand. And so we say thank you very much for taking your time to visit with us and take the time to get into the GoToWebinar control panel and put your questions in there right now. Before I start, I want to let you know we have Alpha DevCon 2017 coming up in October. Pretty crazy how fast this, I mean, we're already through tax day, which was probably not, we shouldn't really talk about that. That's probably not a good subject there. But this week was tax day, so we're rapidly moving through the year, and it's coming up in October of this year in Newport, Rhode Island. So you can go to alphasoftware.com/DevCon 2017. You can find and check out the agenda. You can register now. You can see the speakers. We have such an amazing event plan. This one's going to be just an off-the-charts DevCon. And we really look forward to having all of our esteemed developers join us. And I'll tell you, I find it so valuable, not just the information you gain, but also more the relationships you build and the people you find that can help you out with your projects, with your objectives, with your business throughout the rest of the year. So take the time to go to alphasoftware.com/DevCon, sign up now, and you'll get all the information there, and we look forward to seeing you there. So today, what I would like to talk about is productivity, and specifically the ability to use what are called Xbasic classes to enhance your project. Now, Xbasic classes have actually been around a long time. They've been part of the Xbasic language, and basically Alpha had implemented a object-oriented capability within Xbasic. And it's very powerful because it provides you a lot of really cool benefits when you go down this path. And what I want to also show is in the latest version of Alpha Anywhere, the development environment, they've actually made it even easier to use and consume and leverage Xbasic classes. Again, you could always do this technology. It's always been in there for a while, but now it's even more coming to the forefront of being able to use it in a more effective manner. But what I want to do before I go into actual Xbasic, it's possible, and I apologize for people who are very familiar with computer science and computer programming and object-oriented programming. I'm going to go spend just a few minutes here to kind of bring up to people who may not have exposure to this. So if you'll bear with me, then we'll dive into the piece here. So what are Xbasic, or what are classes? Object-oriented programming comes up with the concept of what is called classes and objects. And classes, think of it as a template for a thing. And you can have in there states, which are things like variables, and behaviors. And I'll show you an example. It'll be much more concrete in a few minutes here. And you'll see it's a very popular methodology. In this case, you're seeing here a Java class, so it's supported in many, many languages. And again, you may have experience with this before. But again, you have an idea where you create a class and then you create specific objects. They're also called instances. And then in there, you're going to have variables, states, and behaviors, which are methods. So you have instant variable where you can track the information about that particular object. Now, the benefit of this is really, really powerful. One is that it really allows you to create modular code. And this is super duper important. And I think if anything, along with the code reuse, which is part of this, this is the key reason I spend a lot of time in this area. First and foremost, it gets you to think about your code as subcomponents or sub-pieces of your project. And what you can do is create modular components that can then be reused over and over again. So for instance, let's say you're going to do an integration with, let's say, Twitter. And you've decided I'm going to go ahead and I need to integrate with Twitter. Well, if you can put it together into an Xbasic class, i.e. you have a class that understands how to talk to Twitter, how to set it, all those pieces there, then what you can do is it's very easy for you to reuse that code on other projects, because that class can be moved to another project and all of that code that you've done is now available. And it also, I think it's more of a mentality thing, is that when you start working with classes, it kind of forces your mind to think of like, how do I deconstruct this into sub-modules, sub-components that are going to be in there? Often what we find out with a lot of folks is that, especially when they're starting out, their code kind of tends to be inline. So let's say they have a UX component, and that UX component puts something onto Twitter. So you have some fields that say, okay, what is my Twitter handle, and what is the comment I want to make, and maybe a time frame it should show up. And then what they'll do is in the Xbasic callback, they'll go ahead and write their code in there to then call Twitter, do the action, and then get the results back. Well, if you start thinking about classes, you start thinking, okay, I'm going to build a core class that understands how to talk to Twitter, and therefore in my Xbasic callback, all I'm going to do is call that class. And so therefore it starts creating modularity. So let's say you have a project in a couple more months and it needs Twitter in there. Now you don't have to go through and dig out all that code that's all essentially hard-coded to the previous one. You can move your class in there into the new one and off the races. And I'll show you the new features that make it even easier for you to do that there. The other is code reuse. Obviously, it's being able to reuse it on there. Information hiding, it just makes your code easier to manage. But also, the last one's very powerful too. It's called pluggability and debugging easy, meaning that you start building these little modules that can be tested individually. So for instance, in that case I was talking about, you can actually test your Twitter class without even having to build a UX or anything like that. So therefore you can write test cases and other things like that. Make sure that that class works perfectly and is rock solid. So now when you go to the next step where you then integrate it into your UX, you don't have to worry about that. It's sort of ready to go. It's clean. It works. You know it's good. So then you can focus more on, okay, how am I going to use that? So you're not going to introduce bugs by copying code into a UX on Ajax callback and then maybe making a typo or something like that. So you can essentially plug these things in to your solution wherever you need it, and your debugging is much easier, it's more reliable, and it's very, very successful there. And so let's see. And so with that in mind, what Xbasic classes are essentially our implementation of this concept. And I'm going to show you one there. But the way to think about a class is that it's a template. It's basically if you have like a template for a Twitter connection, then when you create a new one, like for that particular project or for that particular run, it creates a specific instance of it. And again, I'll show it to you in a few moments from there. Now, very important, this is very cool, and I'm very excited about this, and this is new with our latest release here. Xbasic classes can be password protected, which is, I think it's going to be very cool. We haven't even seen the impact of this yet. idea is that you could basically use the standard text editor / program editor in our IDE to create the classes, test them, etc. But then you can command them to be password protected. And therefore you can then, when you put that class information up on a server, say for a client, it can be protected. It's a password protected environment there. Whereas something like an Xbasic module, someone could go in and look at it and other things. And then the other really cool benefit, and I think this we're going to see a lot more, is that if you want to share your code with other people, you're welcome to give Xbasic classes to people, sort of an open source methodology. But there may be certain classes where you've spent a huge amount of time and effort developing, and they're very complex or very specialized for a particular business or capability. Well, in that case, you can password protect it and then be able to provide them to other people in a secure fashion. They will be able to use your classes, be able to call them and exercise them, etc., but they won't be able to go inside the class and see exactly what's going on there because the code is encrypted and password protected. So I think this is going to open up a lot of really cool things where we may see open source code libraries being put out there for alpha folks that make it easier. Like if someone wraps a Twitter feed, they can throw it out there and then boom, the amount of time it takes you to implement a Twitter now goes down by an order of magnitude. Or if it's especially like S3 or some other specialized external system, even sophisticated as talking to things like NetSuite and Suite CRM and SAP. I mean, we could see some really cool things going around this area. The other aspect I think this is very powerful too is in an enterprise situation, what we're seeing out there is that you have a core set of IT people who understand the real plumbing of the business. But then you have your business analysts who are out there who want to just create the user interfaces and connect their systems. So what can happen now is the core group can create a set of helper classes that say, for instance, know how to call an internal system and get a list of items. So therefore, when the business analyst is using it, they can bring in that class, call it, and then they'll get the JSON back that they can just put into a list control. So they don't have to know anything about the plumbing. It's all in there. And for the IT staff, now they can protect that so they don't have to worry about someone bringing that down and editing it and making tweaks to it, and then they have a non-standard situation out there. So this new feature is really, there's really two cool features. One was this, and the others I'll show you in the IDE that have been added in the latest release that I think is really going to unlock an enormous amount of development and support in this area. So with that, what I want to do is kind of show you a very simple example of an Xbasic class, talk a little bit about how you develop it, what are the pieces to it, how you exercise it, and then from there we can open it up for questions. But before I do that, I want to do a quick check with Dave, make sure my audio is coming through and everything's working okay.
Yep, all okay.
Excellent. So I'm going to go over into my development environment. And again, in this case, very important is that I'm running the new version, 12.4.4, because these new features came out in the latest version. And what I'm in is in my web projects control panel. And normally we spend most of our time here in web components. That's where we create our UX components. And I'll actually show you one that's working there. Now, the new area is, if you'll notice over on the left-hand side, we've always had Xbasic modules, but now we have this thing called Xbasic Class. And this is where you can put in your classes. And you can build your classes, and I'll show you one that's a sample of a truck. And we'll go into detail. Now, the cool thing about this is that I'm going to go ahead and click this little button here that's like a little folder. And what that actually does is open up my directory where all of my files are at. And you'll notice in here, there is my truck.a5xb class. So this is the file where my code is stored. So when I have a new project, all I have to do is take this file and then put it into the new project, and boom, my classes are now available. And as I mentioned before, I can password protect them. So these classes are individual files that can be moved around. You can use them in source control, etc. So therefore, when you create a new project, you could have your standard set of classes, drop them in, boom, all of your capabilities you've built to that basis are available at that time. So let's go ahead and go into this class here and show you what a class looks like. And this is a very simplistic class. Basically, you just say define class and you give it a name, and then in class, and then this is the actual content. So if you'll notice in here, it consists of two areas. One, here are essentially the variables that are associated with a truck. So for instance, I have a truck name, I have a truck weight, a truck driver, and a truck speed. Then I have a set of functions that are part of this class that do certain things. And so, for instance, I have a function, it's called a setter, and I'll explain a little bit more of what you want to do with setters, is where I can set the speed. And in this case, I can call this function and give it a new speed, and it sets this variable to be there. And same thing for get, I can get the speed from here. But then I have some other cool functions. So for instance, I have this function called increase speed, where what I do is I call the function, give it a number, and it will take whatever my current speed is and increase it. And then maybe I want to decrease speed, then I'll have a speed increment, but in this case I decrease it. And then you have down here a stop function that all it does is sets the current speed to be 0. Very simplistic kind of example, but you could see that you may have a set of variables that you need to send to Twitter, and then you would have a set of functions that would say send to Twitter or read from Twitter or whatever they happen to be from there. It's going to depend on your particular domain and area that you're going with. Now I'll come back, I want to show you how this works, but I'm going to talk a little bit about these setters and getters, and also very important, the concept of the visibility of these. So I'll come back there. So I've got a truck here, and again I have these variables here and those functions. So now I've created a little script, and I'll come back and talk about this in a moment, but first thing I do is I dim my truck as truck. So truck is the class, that's this template that I've created. My truck now is an instance of that. So what it will do is it will use that truck and then create a space, and so that thing is unique. So I could have multiple of these out and run. I could have my truck, your truck, our truck, blue truck, yellow truck, whatever. And each one is going to have its own little data that is going to maintain separately. So you'll notice that immediately what I can do is start setting some variables. I'll set the name, I'll set the weight, and I'll set the driver. Now, name is a C or string. Weight is numeric in there. Now, let me go ahead and comment out a couple things here, and you'll see that what I do is after I create my instance of the truck, and then I set these variables here, you'll notice I call the set speed function to set the speed of my truck to 12. And then what I do right away after it is I say, oh, give me back what my current speed is. And then I throw that up in a message box. So now when I run this code right here, let me go ahead and save that and run it, you'll notice that 12 popped up because I set my speed to be 12, and now I'm saying get my speed, so it's just giving me back what my current speed is. Now let's go ahead and do something interesting. I'm going to change this here where I'm going to call one of my functions. So remember, in my truck I have this function called increase speed, where I pass it an increment, and what it will do is it'll increase the speed by a certain amount. So in this case, you'll see we start out at speed 12, but then I'm going to increment it to 11, or increment it by 1, and let's see what the speed is. And so when I run that, you'll notice now my current speed is 13, because I set the speed to 12, then I asked the system to increment it. It looked at that internal speed for this truck and said, oh, it's 12, I'm going to set it up to 1, and from there. And the same thing I can do here is, let's say we increase it and then decrease it by 3, now we're at 10. And then last but not least, I can say, okay, I'm going to increase it. So at each step, I'm setting that internal speed, and then I'm stopping it, and then it comes back as 0, because the last thing I do is set that speed to 0. Now, what's really cool about this, and this is very important, is you'll notice in this case that I never directly set the value of speed. So let's try that. Let's do an experiment here. I'm going to click save, and, oops, wrong thing. I'm going to click save here. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to comment it out. And I'm going to go, my truck dot speed is equal to 100. And I'm going to save that. I'm going to run that. And you'll notice there, not allowed. Since we defined speed as a private member, meaning that the only thing that can change that variable in here, since I called it private, is that the only thing that can change that is routines within here. So you'll notice that I can set the speed here by running this function, or I can set it by running these other functions here. And that's called data hiding. And that's super important, because what you're going to be able to do then is that, for instance, let's say the maximum speed of this truck is 120 miles an hour. Okay, so if I had just exposed this, I could set the speed to 1,000. It would just no matter. But what I can do is in my set speed function right here, I can say if new speed, let's go ahead and do that, is greater than 120 else in div. And these are called setters and getters, so let's say, okay. So if it's that, you can sit there and you say, okay, that's great. And then you can also put right here, you can say new speed is equal to 120. So that's the limiter of what it goes. So the idea behind this is that by not allowing the person to modify this private data, I can now start putting in logic to protect and make sure I don't violate or do something stupid in there. So in this case, what happens is when I set the speed to be that value, I look at it and say, hey, okay, is it greater than 120? Then I'm going to set it to the limit. If not, I'm going to let it go. So let's go ahead and check that out. Go back to my code editor. I'm going to get rid of this. So first I'm going to set my speed. Let's set it to 100 miles an hour. And I run this. Okay. Oh, I had a stop in here. And so I run this. You'll see my speed is 100. Now let's set this to 200. Well, watch what happens. Notice that even though I requested 200, behind the scenes it trapped that condition and said, sorry, this is not a Ferrari truck. You can only go 120 in terms of what you're able to do that. And I could do the same thing. If the speed is less than a 0, then I can set it to be 0. You can't, well, I guess you could have reverse, but maybe there's a reverse speed, meaning that the maximum it can go backwards is -10. So you can say if it's greater than -10 and reverse, it stops it. The idea behind it is I never directly edit the speed itself. That's managed by the code in the instance here. What I do here is I'm managing it here, and these are called getters and setters. And most of them, you'll have those for most of your items. You'll have some public items. You'll notice this is name, weight, and driver. I can set that publicly because I'm not worried about it. It's just, you know, the only thing is I might have a setter for that saying it can't be empty. Like, for instance, I can't set the name to be 0, or I'm sorry, like an empty string. It has to have a certain amount of text. So you'll see you'll start building these that are associated with it, and then you'll have the ability to get set there. But you can get much more sophisticated. So let's say you had a set speed here. Well, there's any other code you want to run. So maybe you have a log file where in the log file it's tracking whenever a speed is changed. Well, you could say save to file, you know, new speed plus speed, because it's been set right here, and then you can go comma C:/ speed log dot text. So the idea here is that I can write any other code I want inside this function, so that every time I set the speed, it's going to do my checks, and then at the same time it's going to save to a log file a little piece of text saying, hey, here it is. And I can put in here, you know, whatever it happens to be. I can say, for instance, truck plus name plus space. So I could say truck, you know, whatever the name of this is, in new speed, and put out the log. The important thing about this is the fact that once you've set this up and run it, you don't have to do a lot of code in here. You don't have to do all that checking in here. The class and the instance will take care of it for you. And it can get very sophisticated because you may be doing a whole bunch of code. These are a few simple lines of text, but you could also have other functions like, you could have functions that say change the oil, and then in there it records a whole bunch of data and other things like that, log data and stuff like that. The sky's the limit. But this is the concept of object-oriented programming. And the important thing about it is it'll take you a little bit more to set it up, just because you got to think about things as objects, and most things are. You have users, you have invoices, you have bill payments, etc. But once you've set that up, now the power of the object becomes really powerful because it takes care of it. And in there you could be writing things to a database, and in this case it's just to a save to file. Now, one other thing I want to mention, this is very, very important. If I go back to my code editor here, it all looks good, but you'll notice that there's something right here. If I'm running code, I don't have to have this line. What will happen is when this line runs right here, it's going to look at my system and say, hey, is there a class called truck? If there is, go ahead and load it. Now, there's two aspects of that. One is that once it's loaded it's into memory, and therefore whenever it reuses it, it's going to be fast, and it uses it in memory. So it's sort of like the system says, hey, I've got this truck thing, it's loaded up, So next time you need to use it, I've got it right here. And the nice thing about that is that then it's very speedy every time you need it from then on. The problem with that is that if you change the class definition, like if I go back in here and I change this and I say dim public new parameter as C. So I've changed my class here. Okay, so I've changed my class. If I go back to my code editor and I don't do this, watch what happens. So I'm going to save this, and remember my new parameter is called new parameter. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say my truck dot new parameter is equal to hello there. Now watch what happens when I run it. It gives me an error. It says wait, truck new parameter not found, because the first time I ran this script, it loaded my truck class in there and it's in memory. And this threw me off when I first got it. I was like, why is this not working? But now if you do this, and basically you run this little thing, every time this runs, it flushes the current class out of the memory and goes to the drive and says, okay, reload this. So now watch what happens. Oh, I can't write. Oh, I put in that code there. I had this in there, so let me get rid of that. Save that there. Okay, so I'm going to run this right here. You'll notice that it didn't throw the error. It liked this new parameter, because what it did is when this ran, it went in here and said, oh, okay, load this thing up and start using it that way versus the one that was already in memory. So that's very important when you're doing your testing, because when you're doing your development testing, you're in here, you're adding new functions, you're adding new parameters, you're doing all these other things like that. And you're going to be running tests and writing your little test scripts. So you want to make sure to do this so that what will happen is every time you change your class and save it, when it reloads and runs in your script. And the same thing works too, is like when let's go here, I'm going to go into my web component. And so you'll notice I have a web component that has a button. And what it does is it runs an Xbasic callback. I still do the flag equals load cache class for two reasons. One is because I want to make sure whatever has the most recent version, but also if you do it this way, it actually speeds up, because when you do this dim the truck, it has to kind of think about it and go, oh, okay, I'm going to interpret that. If you do this, it's already loaded, so this code will run actually a little faster for performance standpoint. But the more important thing is when you're in your test area doing it here. Now the other thing, as I mentioned, this the last part, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dave for questions, is that this is very powerful. And the reason why is, okay, I've developed this truck thing. And so now that I've created this truck thing, I want to make sure it works. I want to make sure the speed piece works. What you can do is you can write test scripts here that exercise that. You could say set the value to be this and then look at the speed. Set the value to this, look at the speed. Set the value to this, look at the speed. And you can create those, and then once you've run those tests, you have confidence that the code inside this thing is going to work. So it actually makes it very easy for you to write what are called unit tests. Unit tests say, hey, I'm not testing the whole system. I'm testing this one piece of code to make sure it does exactly what I want it to do, that it traps error conditions, that it doesn't do things strange. And the cool thing about that is once you run that, if you ever come back in here and modify this, let's say I go dim public another parameter as in, then once I've done that, I can rerun all my test scripts to make sure I haven't screwed things up. Now, that's a simplistic example, but maybe you made some logic change in one of your functions, that the way the speed was calculated is done a little differently, but it should still return the same results. Maybe you found a way to speed it up or optimize it. By having those unit tests, you can run those and feel comfortable that the code inside your class is rock solid and works great and not going to do things weird. And therefore, that's the idea of once you have that done, then when you go to the next step, you're not finding all the dragons, you're just doing the interface with the user interface, and you know those things there. And it turns out to be awesome. I mean, when you have a good set of unit tests with your classes, and you run them consistently, and you have the discipline that every time you create a new class, you create a set of unit tests and run them, then every time you change it from then on, you're going to have that sense of comfort that something weird ain't going to happen next time you run it or hand it to other people. And that, again, that's the concept of unit tests. It's very widely used among all the programming languages, and if you'll notice that in these large systems, there's a ton of unit tests going on. And what's also really cool about that is that down the road, and as we do more enterprise pieces, you can have automated deployment. Like let's say you're going to a new version. Before you do that, you could tell it to run unit tests on all your modules and all your classes before you do that, so you have that level of comfort. And that's more of a common methodology in large system deployment called DevOps, developer operations, is these pieces to increase reliability and make sure you don't get those nasty calls after you make a deployment saying, well, geez, I was able to, my truck can go 500 miles an hour. Why can it do that? Why don't you know that it can go greater than that? Lots of fun stuff there. So that said, check it out. They're Xbasic classes. There's some really nice videos online. You get to them by here. You create a new one. When you do create one, you click class, and it's just going to give you empty there. But every class consists of define class in the name, and then in class, and then in here it's a combination of those. And there's some great samples outlined. And you're going to see over the next 6 months more and more sort of what I would call open source classes are going to be available that you can just drop into your application, have some fun with, and do some other cool things there. So with that, Dave, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to you, see if we have any questions on that and or any other elements.
Excellent. Yes, we do have a couple questions. The first one is, and I think you've been over this at the beginning, but what's the difference again between an Xbasic module and an Xbasic class?
Good point. A module is just a set of Xbasic code that's available. And within a module, you can have classes. So you don't have to necessarily break them out as classes. But a module can have one or more functions, one or more classes, any kind of code that you need from that standpoint there. So what happened is that it wasn't we created classes, we just distinguished them as new entities. So now I'll have a set of different classes. And the main reason behind that is that when you add it to your system now, you're going to see the different classes. When you add a module, you'll see the module name, but in there could be 5 or 6, 10 kind of classes. So you can use either. You can implement these classes in modules, and then you just have to instantiate them with a module, a require module command. But I'd suggest go more heavily towards the Xbasic class there, because in the future you're going to probably have 10 or 15 of these, because you're going to probably have some helper classes that you built just to do day-to-day tasks, things that you do inside a system all the time. I mean, I'm thinking of some like I do tons of database work, so it'd be nice if I had some simplified classes that would, instead of writing 20 lines of code every time I want to connect to a database and run a query, maybe I can just have a class where I load the class and then give it a couple parameters, and then it has everything and it becomes more solid. So again, a module is just a set of Xbasic code. It could include classes. The new Xbasic class is now part of the IDE as a separate, and each class is a single class object that you can include into yours. And the intent down the road is that people will just, instead of putting out modules, they're going to be giving out these classes, these post a class file on GitHub. You can download it and it goes right in your system and you're good to go. Just makes it a little easier to manage.
That's great. This is a related question, and it has to do with those class files that you're creating. How many define statements can you put in? Is it just one define per class?
That's my understanding. You're defining the class itself. I see what you're saying. Kind of like define, another class here. My guess is one per file, but if I have an Xbasic module, you can create multiple classes within an Xbasic module. So if you just wanted to add one file to your system and have all your classes in it, you could put them into a module and then plug them right in there. And by the way, the module, a lot of this concept came from Node. Node has the concept of modules, which is where it's a prepackaged set of code that you can add to an application. So you'll see when you have a Node implementation, you'll say, oh, I'm connecting to XYZ system. Download that module and it brings back a whole bunch of code that you have available. So we're kind of following the same pattern. The idea is more and more break your system into these subcomponents that you can share among your projects, and we'll have third parties building these pieces that you'll be around. The cool thing for ours is you'll be able to password protect your code. So if you actually want to make it into a money-making business, you can say, hey, I'll charge you $50 for this Twitter thing. you know, $50 to save me 4 hours, a heartbeat. I'll do that all day long, and you get the leverage of selling it over and over again. But then I can't go in and, you know, modify the code or take it and use it with someone else. It's kind of built into it. So there's some really neat business opportunities that I think will come out of here. And also, more importantly, is just productivity enhancements, especially for teams, because you can now have one person who's an expert on something, and they can create a class library, hand it to the rest of their team. Boom, they can now use it without having to become a super expert and understand all the nits and gnats and plumbing of how that code works.
Great. So you had mentioned before, I think, about internal functions. How do you prevent a function from being exposed externally if it's part of a class?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, again, functions have, I think you have the same nomenclature. Let me make sure. Like, let's say, let's create a new one here. Do you have that link that Sarah put out this morning, Dave?
I do.
Okay, hey, very interesting. Because of this new capability, Sarah, our lead of documentation, has consolidated all this information about classes into a single link, and we're going to put that into the GoToWebinar chat box. So I highly recommend grab that link, bookmark it, and a lot of details there, and we'll come back to there. So while you're doing that, so let's say I have a new function here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to put in here, and I'm going to call this secret function. That, and I'm not going to have any parameter in here. I'll go speed is equal to 1,000. So maybe it's, what is Marty? What is it? It's from Back to the Future or something like that. So let's say I want this. I can now, if I believe this correctly, you can define this is what's called a private function. And the cool thing about that is now this function is not available. And I'd have to double check this, but now this cannot be seen from outside. So often as these become more complex, you'll have sub-functions that you want to run internally that you can test and make sure they work, and then other parts of it run it. So you can kind of nest these functions inside each other. And so you can use that with its by adding some terms in there saying, like in this case, private versus public. I believe it's the same nomenclature, and so therefore this function won't show, but the code is working and will be available. Now, to run this function, I need to call it within another function, so I can just say secret function. There you go. And now when this runs right here, it's going to run this code right here, but it all stays inside the family right there. So it's a true function available within there. So let's say you had a complex item where you were doing the same thing over and over within it. You could separate that into a secret private function and then have the other functions call that within it, which is a very common design pattern. So that's a really good question there. Now there's another thing that's really, really cool too, and I'm not going to get into much detail, but you can also have what are called static functions. So let me go ahead and paste this here. Let me get rid of this here. And there's some documentation on this. This is really powerful. So I can go here and I can say function, and I'm going to call it static, and I'm going to call it cool function, and it does something, whatever it happens to do, who knows from there. Now, you'll notice that when I ran this, I did dim my truck as truck, and then once I had my truck, I could start putting in names, and this is called an instance. Once I create that instance, then what's going to happen is then I can set the values of the image. So down here, I could do this where I could say dim my truck to. So this is one instance called my truck, and this is another instance. They're both based on the same class, but this instance now has a certain set of data, and this instance would have a different set of data. And then you can manipulate them, and you could put them in collections and things like that. But you'll notice that each time I have to do this, I have to say dim my truck is there. Now, what's great with what's called a static is that maybe you just wrote a class that runs an operation, like has a cool function that says calls the current weather and gives you the current weather based on a zip code kind of thing. Well, you don't necessarily want to have to sit there and run all this. So what you can do is, if you define what's called a static function, I can go in here and actually say truck dot and what cool function. And what it will do is result is equal to truck my cool function. And let's give this a try. I don't know if I've got it right here. I can say cool function equals cool. Okay, so let's give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all this right here. I'm going to comment it out. And again, may not work, but I want to check this out here. I'm going to comment that out here. So I'm going to say result, and then I'm going to go message box result. Okay, so you notice I'm not creating it. Does it work? My truck. Oh, forgot one. So, oh, okay. Hold on a second. I'm going to return it as C. So I'm going to return a text value here. Check it out. So what happens is I don't have to create an instance of this. A static function doesn't require an instance. The rest of the functions do. I couldn't say truck.setSpeed because it needs to have an instance to work on. But what's neat about this now is that you'll notice it makes your code simpler. You could create a, like Twitter dot add tweet, and then in here you can go hello, comma, blah, blah, blah. And so therefore you can just create your own essentially class library where you don't even have to create an instance of it. You can just say, hey, twitter.this, and boom, it looks up, it knows it's in that class, and you don't have to create an instance. And that's called a static function because it doesn't have to have an instance that's been created for it to operate. And those are powerful. Like for instance, you'll see in alpha that we use that a lot, is that in our own code, and it's kind of always been behind the scenes, like when you're dimensioning a new SQL connection, we don't actually have to create a whole bunch of stuff. So that's called a static function. There's a great description of how that works in the documentation that's being sent out, but it really adds a lot of flavor because you can basically create a class that has a whole bunch of static functions, and therefore then those are just all your helper functions that are available anytime you need them. You just say my super class dot send email, and it's got a whole bunch of code that's in there that just is available for me to use and operate from there. I hope that makes sense. Kind of that's a little deeper topic, but there's some really good documentation on that.
Excellent. Hey, that's great. So back to a previous answer that you gave regarding the use of classes in Xbasic modules. We have Sarah Mitchell on the line who actually says that your answer
the person who actually knows
could be more correct. Could be more correct. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'll let her say that it was wrong. But I'm going to put her on right now, and she's going to go back and fix that answer. It isn't correct.
Okay.
So,
So,
hello, Sarah, are you there?
yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I sure can.
The critical difference between Xbasic modules and Xbasic classes is that you cannot declare an Xbasic class in an Xbasic module. They have to be an Xbasic class file. And that's the key difference. That's why they were added and exposed.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Because
I don't
people
think you
tried
can
to-
create them
and it didn't
in
work.
function libraries either, so, but I haven't tested that.
Oh, you know what? You're right. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I used to, by the way, I used to go in here in code and create my classes here.
Yeah, you can do it
And
there
then-
for sure.
Okay, and that was the old school. The problem with that is that information, it wasn't like a file you could just move around. It was tightly integrated with the solution and kind of a real big pain in the tail to make everything work properly.
Right.
So that's where my confusion. So thank you for correcting me on that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think you can declare multiple classes in a class file, so.
And the only
Worth
question is,
trying.
the question which would be which one? Yeah, maybe I'll do
Yeah.
that.
I think it loads all of them.
Right.
When it loads
I
the
would
file.
suggest everybody, maybe each one in its own file, mainly because you want to, again, back to the pre-key concept, if I go back to here, pluggability and debugging ease, is that the more you can make things functional, modular, and granular, you can run unit tests on each, and therefore each of these become like bricks in your foundation. And therefore you'll have a whole bunch of these class libraries that will become the bricks of your foundation. And you're going to find, and this is the most important thing, and the real reason I wanted to talk about was productivity, is that if you invest in doing things along these lines, what you'll find out is your next project, you'll go, oh my gosh, 20% of this code I wrote for Joe Schmo or for this project, I just have to bring those class libraries in. Boom. Now I can price on value, not time. And therefore also you can focus more of your energy on making cool things. And those classes will really make an enormous impact on the productivity because and also what I would call reliability, because once these classes have been tested and are baked and fully checked and all good, then you don't have to worry about new bugs coming up in them. It's pretty neat. They're very solid. So leverage productivity and the reliability of your solution if you invest in that. Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate the confirmation. That way people don't waste their time making mistakes that I would have.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Dion, when you were doing some of your sample code, you had something defined as V, as in Victor. Was that?
Yeah, what V is we have our standards C, N, T, D, etc. V is a special kind of it's called, I forget what the exact term on it, but basically it's a special type that can hold different types in it. So with a V can actually be a C and N, a very complex like an array. It can be very kind of things here. So it's just a special type. And again, Sarah, you may want to put the link to that description of that from that standpoint there. But it's just think of it as a generic type, variable type that can hold many different things inside of it. So for instance, I use V's a lot when I'm doing things along the lines of arrays and stuff like that, where I'll build an array and then want to give it back. Well, that's not a C or this or a P, a pointer variable. It's actually a special type of item there. And Sarah, if you have any other comments on that, please add to this. I'm probably not explaining correctly.
Excellent. All right, so let's switch gears here for a minute. Let's go back to our previous webinars, and we have a question here about control bars and control bar disclosures. So the question is that the person has a control bar disclosure and it has an edit box in it. They want to know, how can you set the focus, or can you set the focus to that edit box?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I'll be upfront. I think that's one we'll have to do a little research on to do that. That's a very good point, because you want, once that disclosure pops up, you want it to be ready to go for the person to type things into. My guess is there's probably a little JavaScript that you can add when the disclosure fires to set the control. And the reality is, and since it's not a control, I mean, there is a dialog.object.setFocus that's built into the regular JavaScript library, but it actually have to be there. I wonder, the only thing is, no, I didn't see that in the action JavaScript code anywhere there. So don't know off the top of my head. We'll have to look into that, and we'll find that out and get that information to you. So if you can email us to make sure we know who this is, so we can send the response back to you as soon as possible.
Excellent. All right, despite the fact that we have an awful lot of people on today, we have not that many questions, but I know I've got...
Meetings will be reinstituted.
Exactly, that's right. We're going to go back to the 2-question minimum, but I do have one here for you. And here's a question about, how do you differentiate between mobile app and desktop app if they're both pointing to the same source? In other words, you want to have a different default page for your mobile app than you want for your web version, but you want them to point to the same data source. How would you make a distinction there?
Dun, 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 dun. Go to Web Component, App Launcher. We have a built-in control, and this built-in control is very cool. It can do a couple different things. One is that when it runs, you can set a default style, but when it runs, it's going to detect the environment it's running on. And once that happens, you can then determine which startup component you want to use. So if you have a mobile, you go to a UX or whatever it happens to be. But the other thing that's really cool too is you can also set up what style they're going to use here. So it's called the App Launcher, and it's smart enough to say, oh, I know you're on a mobile platform, so I'm going to send you to this UX, and you can load up this UX. Oh, you're on a desktop web. Oh, I'm going to go to this UX. And also I can set some some styles. I can also set a whole bunch of arguments and load other things that are needed. But it's called the App Launcher, and there's a fabulous video that walks you through exactly how to set this up and work with it. And I think you'll find it's a really, really powerful little tool that's been in there for a while. But again, called App Launcher, and you can, there's a, if you don't mind, Sarah, you probably know maybe where that, if you could put that in the GoToWebinar chat window, they can link to that and be able to see it right there. Very cool stuff.
Excellent. Back to classes. You used the load class function to make sure that the newest version of your class was being loaded and you weren't going to get some weird unpredictable results. So that totally makes sense during development. But when your app is all done and it's ready to go live, would you still use load class, or would you omit the load class?
I would still use it as a practice. Yeah. And the reason why is that if I don't have it here and I do this, Alpha's smart enough to say, oh, truck, that must be a special class. And so then it goes searching for that information on your system. It goes looking for your class library, whether it's in the built-in or if it's not class library, but class description, or as a file on your system, and then it loads it up. The only thing is there's a small performance penalty when it's doing that. With this, it says, oh, I know exactly what to do, and it loads it, and then therefore your code after it works. So the answer is no, you don't have to, but I would make it a practice to load that class. Now, the other thing that's cool too is that you'll notice that it's actually, actually I didn't do this right, but flag as L. Flag is what's called a Boolean, meaning it's a yes or a no. And so then you can say if flag is equal to false, then error generate can't find file. So the other thing that's kind of nice about this is that if for whatever reason on that system that class file is not on there, then you can trap that before seeing a weird error happen down here. So it allows you to have a little bit more control over your solidity and reliability of your application, because you can actually say, oh wow, it didn't find that class, so was it not published to the server, or did it have a name change, or those kind of things there. So first you get an improvement in speed, but secondly you also have a little bit more control to be able to detect if there's a problem finding that class library. So up to you on how you approach on that. Either one is more than acceptable.
Excellent. Here's a question, and this is sort of an advanced one, but is it possible to use a REST data source genie for creating an Xbasic class? For example, if you wanted to create a Dropbox API function and turn that into a protected class.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really where I see people will be using wrapping these third-party services. So within my class right here, I could put the code in here that does the actual web API call, etc. I'd have to pass it like, the ID and the secret password, whatever happens to be. But then you could write all that code in here, and then out here you can say, eventually like dim my Dropbox as Dropbox class, and then I can say my Dropbox dot, and by the way, it's got autocomplete. So once they've defined it, then you can see these things. Actually, let me go ahead and do this. So then I go my Dropbox dot token is equal to blah blah blah. So I would set my token so the code knows what to use. Then I go my Dropbox dot file upload, and then I'd put in c/test.txt. And maybe I have something like, and then the bucket it's supposed to go to, destination, etc. So the idea is that once you've defined and done all that hard work of putting in all that, you can reduce it down to what is looks like normal Xbasic, meaning you declare it, you set some variables, and then all that funky code is called there. So that's a great way to go about it. And again, what I mentioned, and I'll explain it here. Let me go ahead and save this. Let me get, well, there went. Did I do something? What did I do wrong? Which... on 38. Ooh. Oh, this is my garbage. Okay. And I just want to get out real quick. Bear with me, everyone. just want to refresh my system so it's ready to go. So I'm loading in here. It's just refresh. So give me, of course, it would take forever to do this. Okay, so I got my truck thing. I'll go back here. I'll design this. So now I want to create a new one. So I'm just going to go down here and say, you know, dim cool truck as truck. Now I can go cool truck dot and check it out. The cool thing about it is that, let's see. There's a refresh thing. I have reported that, but normally what it will do is it will actually look at that class and show you what the things you can attach, the functions and the other pieces there. And therefore then it even walks you through basically how to do the code. You don't have to go look at the documentation. You can say cool truck dot, and then it will show you the parameters and the variables you can set, and also the functions there. I'm not sure this, I think it's just I'm on a pre-release, so it may be something there. But once you get going, then it's going to be super easy for you to take these things. Because you might have written that a little while ago. It's like, well, how do I use that? Oh, here it is. Just shows you through autocomplete, and therefore you can even code faster.
Excellent. Okay, this is a troubleshooting question, and here is the issue, and sort of, I guess the question is, how would you go about looking for the solution? So here's the problem. This person created a UX component to enter new records, and it works fine in working preview mode. But when they publish it and they try to open it up, they get an error message which says, please add controls to the UX component. Likewise, when they're using the application works, but when they try to get to that UX, they get the same error. Where would you begin to look for that? It seems like maybe you're not referencing the UX you thought you were, or I could think of a few places, but I was wondering if you had any ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so they've coded UX that works good on a working preview, but when they publish it to the server, it's the only thing I would say is that if you are launching a UX, you want to make sure it's pointing to the right UX, because and this happens mainly like, let me go ahead and create a web component here. So I might have a UX here, okay, and I'll go ahead and just go in here. So let's say I have a button here, and that button is then I'm using the UX component, open a UX component here, and I'll go UX name, and then I'll select my UX to load there. The trick is I would look at that to make sure it's opening up the proper one, because it could be pointed to an old version of your UX kind of scenario there. The other is I usually turn off cache component, because that sometimes creates some weirdness pieces there. But often when you're getting an error like that, if it's working on working preview, and then you do a publish to the server, wherever it happens to be, that's going to be up on that server. So then the question becomes, what is calling that to load it? Is it calling the proper item? So, if you have another, like a tabbed UI, and that tabbed UI is launching UXs into panels, then I would check to make sure it's pointed to it. Because here's the deal. If, let's say, when you publish, it doesn't delete anything off the server. So you could have like an old version that's named something somewhat differently. That's going to still be up on the server, because when you go to publish, it doesn't do like a scrub. It just pushes the new stuff and the changed stuff up to the server. So one thing I would do is I would delete all the stuff on the server and do a complete reflush, if that's okay. It depends on your environment. I mean, you may not want to do that, but I sometimes I'll go through and kind of go clean out all the existing grids and components on my server, and then do a complete refresh publish, so that way I know only on that server is what on my local here. Because, for instance, in your file, you'll have a bunch of deleted files. They're deleted locally, but they're not deleted on the server. So it's possible you're calling an old version, like one that's slightly named differently, that's causing you that kind of scenario. Like essentially your development environment, your production environment is a little out of sync, and that's what usually causes those pieces there.
Also, during publish itself, it's possible to tell Alpha Anywhere, look, even if you think I've published it, the latest thing up, go ahead and publish it again.
Yeah, right here. Just publish new or modified.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can also clear
So
the
it's a
public
clear.
history, which essentially says, oh, everything's brand new and fresh. Push it all up there.
Yeah, that's what I look to. Yep, great. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank you, Dion, for presenting and answering questions. I want to thank everyone who showed up today, especially those people who asked questions. And keep in mind, you could ask your questions in advance by sending them to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. I don't believe we are going to have another webinar next week. I think we're going to take a week off because Dion will be off doing some sort of training. But then we will be back.
Yeah, next Tuesday is the certification training.
Next
So if you haven't signed up.
Thursday, yeah, exactly. So anyway, we'll be in touch about that, and we will send you off an email to let you know what our webinar schedule will be. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.